I'm Dave Renz. As of the beginning of this month, I'm Director Emeritus, which is fancy for the old guy who used to run it, and Director Emeritus of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. Pleasure to be with you and have you all with us as we head into our session on looking ahead and making sense of this construct, this notion of well-being. We're delighted that we have a colleague who's worked with us at the Midwest Center for years and years. Not that she's that old, of course, just experienced and knowledgeable. So our facilitator presenter today is Phyllis Becker. Phyllis is somebody that we've worked with. Frankly, I've worked with Phyllis and it's been a real privilege to do so for almost 30 years, 28 years, something like that.
You had to tell him, Dave.
What's that?
I said you had to tell him 30 years.
Right? Was I? Yeah. And Phyllis has been an executive in state government and nonprofit agencies. She's an experienced facilitator and trainer in many settings. Most recently, she is, and this is why we've invited her to join us today and do this session. She is a senior fellow with the Full Frame Initiative. She is also a senior fellow with us at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership at UMKC. And she brings an exceptional range of executive and field experience working with families, kids, leaders in workplaces, communities. It's just a very extensive perspective to bring to the topic we have today, which is this introduction to well-being. So without any further ado, Phyllis, would you care to share your screen and or jump in, whatever makes sense for the start?
Well, first, I'll just thank you and Mark and Cindy in the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership for inviting me here today. I'm excited to be a part of this navigation series. I've attended many sessions as a participant, and I've always taken something away from it. So I'm really glad to give back and be here today. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint.
And while you're doing that, let me reinforce what Mark wrote to everybody in the chat box, which is that there are a couple of resources tied to today's session in the box. Look at your chat and you'll find the link for that chat.
Okay. As Dave was saying, I am a senior fellow with the Full Frame Initiative as well as with the Midwest Center, and I feel very fortunate to have both of those roles. And as is with life, things start to integrate and cross, and that's what has happened here. So I'm really happy about that. Full Frame Initiative is a social change organization that partners with organizations and systems and communities to shift the focus from fixing problems to fostering well-being. And the work that I'm going to be sharing with you all today comes from the Full Frame Initiative. And I'm also really excited. We have one of my colleagues is here from the Full Frame Initiative, Madge Haynes. So she's here, and I don't know if Lotus is here or not, but we had another colleague that may be here, and her name is Lotus Liu. So I'm glad that you guys can make it. And please feel free to add to the conversation. So before we get into the content, a couple things. I'll be going over an overview of well-being orientation. By our definition, a well-being orientation can position an organization to be more adaptable when crisis hits and weather crisis better. So I'm going to share in general about well-being, kind of a foundational understanding about how we talk about it. And then I want to weave in about implications regarding crisis, our current crisis and beyond the crisis. And I'm also going to try to weave in examples of what that looks like in operations. And warning for you, I tend to have too many slides. Madge looked at my slides. She said, "You got a lot of information here." So I may, just depending on where the conversation goes, go through some quickly and skip some. But I promise you, I'll give you that foundation around a well-being orientation. So it's always important to kind of start with the why. And so when we're looking at well-being, one of the whys is that well-being is universal. It's a universal need. Those we serve need it, we need it, staff need it, and our communities need it. It's a systemic focus and focuses on strengths and builds resilience. It also is an orientation that can help you leverage sustainable outcomes. I have also interwoven some quotes in my session, and this quote is from the WellBeing Blueprint, which is a roadmap for systemic transformation and a community of action. And in that blueprint, they talk about how COVID has brought our attention to how universal, well-being is, and isn't that true when we think about what we've been through for the last year and a half. It's also important to, hold on, I'm moving on, to think about the difference between what we're talking about, systemic well-being and individual wellness. Staff wellness has become very big, and it really is a very important piece of it, but a well-being orientation, although it does encompass individual wellness, it's broader than wellness focus. So I just wanted to suss that out a little bit too, as part of the definition of systemic well-being. So in a wellness focus, we're really focusing on individual, typically speaking, their health. And a well-being orientation, we're looking at multiple levels, and we're looking at domains of well-being, which I'll get into in a little bit. On that wellness side, it's the focus on the individual to repair, or the system to fix the individual. When we're looking at a well-being orientation, we're looking at the individual, but we're looking really critically about what are the conditions impacting well-being, in either positive or negative ways. On a wellness focus is kind of a symptom insufficiency focus. What's wrong with the person, or what's the issue. Well-being orientation, we're trying to focus on those core needs and focus again on strengths. And keeping with the theme on the wellness side, is about people overcoming barriers to attain wellness. And a well-being orientation, we're looking at shifting structures and conditions that create the barriers or block access to well-being. So wanted to kind of put that out there as part of a definition, part of our definition of well-being. And then again, we said there are multiple focus areas, and well-being can be looked at through an individual, through a family, an organization, and their program, including their culture, policy, procedures, and practices, and those they serve and who work for them, a community and national level. So it's multiple layers that well-being can be applied. So why would we want to look at well-being during turbulent times? I know I was working with Full Frame Initiative when the pandemic hit. And I know having a well-being orientation really kept us focused on that North Star and the universal needs. So we didn't get caught up and reactive in part of the crisis. So it helps you keep you focused. It provides that systemic framework to assess what needs to be paid attention to during the crisis. So you can create strategies that not only may work in the moment and support people's well-being, but also set the default beyond the crisis, and it provides a context to address inequity and access issues from a systemic perspective. And I'm going to talk we'll go a little deeper into the equity piece as well. And if you have thoughts and comments, do feel free to put them in the chat, because Dave and others will be looking at that and bringing them to my attention. Also, when we're looking at a well-being framework, and one that I liked, and I worked with Full Frame when I was an administrator for the Missouri Division of Youth Services. And it was real helpful to us in strengthening our approach with the youth. We were a organization that focused on well-being, but the well-being frame really kind of helped us strengthen that and deepen that in our system, and move out of the whole fix-it deficit piece of our work, and looking at what is working well and what are core needs. And also it's a framework that helps us move into a place of co-creating strategies with individuals and communities. And, as one of the things that I found was that in our system, sometimes we wanted to do things for our kids versus work with them and their families and co-create strategies. The deeper we shifted into that co-creating piece, the better outcomes we had, and the more sustainable the change was. So you really cannot talk about well-being without talking about equity. We have seen how the pandemic and the Black Lives Movement has fully pulled back the curtain on issues of equity and access, and the need for the support for well-being for all. And we have seen, and many of you know this already, that the systems, those who are served by our systems, are disproportionately impacted by crisis. And a well-being orientation really keeps that at the forefront and thinking about how we use our time, our money, and our resources to have sustainable impact. I've been really fortunate to work with systems and leaders that have had a well-being orientation. They may not have called it that, but the work I've done recently has really deepened my understanding on how barriers to access to well-being is such a core driver of inequity. Many times those barriers to access are things we are not even aware of because they're so ingrained in our structures, our systems, our policies, and our culture. So I've really gotten a much better understanding of that. And the well-being orientation helps you kind of bring that up and think about that in ways to do some different strategies that move you out of inequity to equity. So now I want to take some time, and this is kind of getting us into the foundation of well-being and our definition of it. We know that there are very good definitions of well-being out there, and we welcome that learning. And my work with folks dealing with different definitions of well-being, there's so many commonalities among it, but there's also that uniqueness as folks adapt it to their field or across organizational boundaries. And we very much welcome that diversity of thinking. We'll move into how we define well-being. We define it as a set of needs and experiences that are universally required in combination and balance to weather challenge and have health and hope. And those needs and experience have to do with these 5 domains: social connectedness, stability, safety, mastery, and meaningful access to relevant resources. We all need these. We all don't have equal access to it, but having access to well-being does improve our health, hope, and resilience. And so that is our kind of short definition, and I'm going to go now into those domains a little deeper. And before I go into domains, I want to talk a little bit about some things about the domains. They're universal, they're interdependent. Not one is not better or worse than the other. They're asset-based, they're drawn from practice, validated by research, as we had talked about, is relevant at multiple levels, deeply informed by culture, context, and history, which gets us into the equity pieces. And it's a reflection of an orientation to practice and outcomes it's not a prescription for programs where you're not going to be a 5 domains program, right? It's not that kind of, that's not the work. It's about an orientation and a set of things to think about to support well-being. So when we're looking at the domains, and I'm just going to, with each of the domains, hit on some key aspects of that domain. And if you see in the blue boxes to the right, these are related terms and concepts. We wanted to provide that as well, because oftentimes we will all be talking about well-being, but we use different words. So it's helpful to try to kind of make a bridge between language and create common languages. So we have added that to this slide. So when we're talking about social connectedness, and of course, we've gotten great lessons around the importance of social connectedness and how hardwired we are for that through this pandemic and all the challenges of isolation that we've experienced. So we know that's important. When we're thinking about social connectedness, I would encourage you not to also think about the give and the get. A lot of times when we talk about social connectedness, especially when we're talking about human services, we're talking about what we're going to give people or what people got to give, or what people are going to get. And we sometimes miss the part about giving and the back and forth of the give and get is critically important to our well-being. So I wanted to bring that to the forefront on that. In terms of stability, those are the anchors. I want to really kind of push on those anchors. That was really something that stuck with me when I was learning about the 5 domains, and particularly in working in residential care, about how these anchors that people have are really important to their stability. And it's those kind of rituals and routines that we have from day to day that keep us oriented. And there's research that talks about and illustrates how rituals can desensitize the anxiety reactions our brains can have, and that it can mitigate negative experiences. And so something, and it can seem so small. So all I got to say is don't feel bad about your daily morning coffee. It's helping you. It brings some stability to your day-to-day life. And when we think about working with people, and often we don't think about it, is when we're working with folks in terms of services, what are things we're asking people to give up in terms of their anchors and their rituals that actually cause stress in that domain. The other part of stability is that we're looking at in that domain, if you have enough assets in that domain to buffer small problems before they snowball into big problems. I imagine for many of us who are attending today, if our car broke down on the side of the road, we would have 2 to 3 people we could call to help us out. We could call our boss. We wouldn't lose money because we're late to work. And we get the car fixed and our life goes on. So this small problem didn't snowball. For many people, and particularly people in distressed and disenfranchised communities, a car breaking down could result in lost pay. Lost pay can result in not being able to pay the rent. Not being able to pay the rent can result in eviction. So you can see how that works out if you don't have assets in that domain, and how that can turn just a small problem into a big problem. So again, very important to think about when we're thinking about working and creating strategies. And also because we want to look at what the stability factors that they do have, and also the places where they're having where we're having challenges. On safety, the thing I want to emphasize is often in human services, we over focus on physical safety, sometimes to the expense of some of the other domains, like safety at the expense of social connectedness or stability. And just something to think about. Safety is both physical and emotional. Some of the things done in the name of physical safety, for example, historically in the juvenile justice system, have been very harmful. So we want to think, and safety can be about a person, people, a place, and a system. And then again, you have your related terms over here. In thinking about mastery, we like to define that as kind of the high five moments that you have. This is not the skill you have that you're just naturally gifted at. We're talking about those things where you had to work hard to get there and practice and persevere to get there, resulting in your high five moment. So, and that is important. We have to feel like we can overcome challenges, overcome big things in our life and have that sense of agency. So that's what that domain's about. When I was working with kids in the juvenile justice system, many of the kids, they were the first person in their family who would get a high school diploma or even some college degrees. It was a lot of work. We had to work hard with the family and the teachers and the staff, and our graduations were moments of huge joy and victory because of that mastery piece. And then on the last domain, meaningful access to relevant resources, I'd have you focus on the word meaningful and the focus relevant. You can provide a really good service, but if it takes 3 buses to get there, meaningful access may not let that happen. Relevant, you may have a great service, but it may not be what people think they need or want. And so often when I've worked with organizations and they talk about, or when we're assessing their services, and they're like, well, people aren't accessing this great service I have. Often I have them look at this domain. What's your access and what's your relevancy to the folks you're serving. So
Phyllis, do you want to take a question now, or would you like to?
No, go ahead. We're at the question page, so that's good.
Yeah, well, so Angela has raised the question of how we get individuals involved to move from a mindset of self-focus in terms of well-being to where they're just surviving, et cetera, to really being more group-oriented and the group focus to changing systems, including government systems, where they don't understand its impact. They may fear approaching those systems. Perhaps you're going to get to some of that as we talk through this, but I wanted to raise the question now. I think it's a very good one, and makes sense to think about it.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because when you're looking from a well-being focus, you're looking at what is the history of what are people's history with systems, and there's been a very shady, painful history with many of our systems from the people who are being served by our systems. And so on that individual level for those people, one of the things we did, for example, is we explicitly asked the parents, what's been your experience with us and other systems, and give them the space to talk about it. The other thing we do with individuals around that is oftentimes when we're dealing with folks coming into our system, we're focusing on their problem versus, and what's wrong, versus kind of getting their opinion on what strengths are they bringing to the table. And so it's, and in order to kind of get to that kind of conversation, you have to work with your folks in your system to shift to thinking, we're not fixing people, we're working with people to deal with some challenges. And so, so that changes the conversation. So you kind of have to work on the system level, and then you have to work on your strategies and making those shifts. I hope that was helpful. The other questions, like Angela's question was a great question. So these are just questions you can ask yourself as system leaders when you're thinking about those domains. It's not an all-inclusive list, but just some things that we would say to ourselves, or I have said to myself when I was a system leader, and understanding the difference of how people perceive safety, And we're working with, when I was a young staff, a lot of my work took me all across Missouri. And, I had some challenges driving across rural Missouri in some towns. I had fears. I had a sense of perceived unsafety, right? But some of my other staff had fears around going into the neighborhood that I lived in, right? So how people perceive safety is incredibly important and relevant to our work. And so so the question becomes, do you create space for those conversations to happen? Do you create space for people to be their true selves and bring their core identities into the workplace without harm or humiliation? And when you think about meaningful, relevant access, what does that mean to you? And then, because things have shifted so dramatically because of the pandemic, what does that mean in terms of the pandemic right now? So those are questions to think about when we're looking at the domains. I want to take a second then also to talk about the concept of trade-offs and well-being. Excuse me, I'll get a little glass of water. We know what trade-offs are. The trade-off is, when we decide if something's worth it or not, when we're balancing trade-offs. So you get a new job in another state with a ton of money. You're like, great, I'm going to have some stability in my, increase my assets in my stability domain. But then when you start looking at it, you're like, wait a minute, my mother-in-law, my sister babysit the kids, and I won't have that resource. And is that going to be worth it? So, so you're looking at those trade-offs between those domains. And in that scenario was like stability, social connections. So sometimes, so when we're thinking about it from a well-being perspective, we need to understand that if a change involves significant trade-offs, and if the trade-off is too big, that change will not be sustainable. And sometimes when we're providing services or working with folks, we're not aware that we're creating these untenable trade-offs for folks. And we can often maybe attribute that to a person not being motivated. And so I know when I was working with staff and they would say, well, this young person is not motivated. And I'm like, so can you just dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on? Because, it's like, this is a great opportunity. Why don't they want to do it? Well, they may be, struggling with this idea of trade-offs and what they have to give up in order to do the change that's being asked of them, or the change that may be even good for them. But what do they have to give up? We were working with some people, and I was just struck when we talked about trade-offs and giving things people have to give up. People were mourning and grieving and getting in touch with some of the things they gave up. And I was just struck by how powerful that is and how impactful that was to them in their life, and them assessing, wow, did I really want to make that trade-off? And why did I make that trade-off? Or what can I do now that I'm aware of what this trade-off has cost me? So when we're doing services, it's really critical, and particularly also during crisis, because we tend to get urgent and reactive, is that we assess the trade-offs that might be created by our strategies to address crisis. And I'm going to have some examples for you right here. These are some examples to kind of pull some of the stuff we've been talking about together. And how am I doing on time, Dave?
You're doing fine.
Okay, great. So these two are service delivery strategies. The first one, you have a client you have required appointments. And we know these appointments are important because you're going to provide a really important service to the person. But if it takes 3 buses to get to that, adding hours to the trip, the client has no sick leave. This would force a trade-off between work and the required appointment, impacting so this is not really a meaningful access for this client. Might be relevant, but it's not meaningful access, and it impacts their stability to try to get there. a service delivery strategy for housing. You have a single mother is homeless. They're providing a home for her miles away from her family, friends, and church. So again, we may not be thinking about that. We might be thinking about, wow, we got this home finally, and we know how hard it is to find homes for people. And this mother is not acting excited or even wanting to do it. And so she may be struggling with the trade-off, between her social connections and getting this meaningful piece of housing in her life that might improve her stability. So you can see, so we have to think about those trade-offs of what we're creating, can be adding to or not adding to. I'll skip down to the policy and values one right here. So you have a agency that really in their values say they really value family engagement, but in their policy, appointments can only happen during business hours and when families can't attend. So again, that's another issue. Are we really making that service, is it meaningful access to that service? Here's the last one as an example is around the crisis strategy and kind of relevant to some of the worlds I have lived in. So during the pandemic, some juvenile detention centers were put into the place of trying to figure out how to keep kids from passing COVID. And so their solution was to put them in their individual rooms / cells to avoid the spread. But kids were then being isolated for long periods of time, which is not best practice and very harmful to youth well-being. And then kind of creates a scenario of, if you get kids who are isolated, some of the impact of that actually can make the scenario even worse. So, but this is also a good example because this is a real challenge. What are you going to do to help, to make sure kids are safe and not spreading that? That was a real issue those systems had to deal with. So when we're thinking about trade-offs, you want to look at, because it doesn't mean trade-offs aren't going to happen. Trade-offs are always going to happen. It's how do we avoid or mitigate trade-offs that are harmful and hurtful? So with the juvenile detention centers and residential care, people came up with real creative strategies because their universal need for well-being did not change. How they met that need had to change. And so they did things like they broke their groups into smaller groups so they can create really good social distancing practices with masks so kids could be in the same room with each other. They really did a good job. Some of the systems did really good jobs of getting the required PPEs for their staff, so staff could actually interact with them. If they couldn't interact with the kids, at least they were interacting with the staff. Things like keeping the doors open. One place I know, they put some soothing music throughout the whole room, so it wasn't as stressful. And then, of course, the use of technology to keep people connected and offset that social isolation was used too. So that's what we're looking at, how to avoid or mitigate it. And, and how can we support well-being, build assets in those domains? And the other thing to think about in terms of questions is, how do our policies, structures, and practice impact populations differently? And who is impacted and why? Because sometimes we'll make these great policies and for maybe staff or ourselves, it's great because we have a different level of assets, but for our clients, it's not so great, right? So we have to see how people are impacted by whose well-being is impacted and how's it differently impacted. And then what can we do to kind of, through our policies and structures, put into practice long-term solutions that support well-being. And then these last two slides kind of summarize some of the key points from what I've been talking about this morning. When you're in crisis, creating shortcuts, avoid creating shortcuts in response to the crisis. I was talking to a person, a leader, and they, when the crisis hits, like, well, we can't think about all that treatment stuff now. And, because of the pandemic, and kind of my response is, well, no, you really kind of have to double down on that treatment stuff right now because it's more needed than ever because of the crisis. So we don't give up. Well-being, the need for well-being doesn't go away just because we have a crisis, and strategies that support well-being need to continue. So just try to avoid getting up in that drama, urgent cycle, and just reacting to that urgent symptom. And you want to be responding versus reacting, and responding in a way to address well-being. And then this last one is just some things to think about if you're thinking about shifting that lens to well-being. We really need to legitimize and build on our need for well-being, recognize and legitimize that need for everybody, and see people in the full frames of their lives. And the other one I would, I won't read all these, but one I would lift up a little bit is, post-crisis, during the pandemic, what really did work that actually impacted well-being in ways that were useful and that were different, because crisis could help us, does put us in a position to really come up with innovative strategies and determine what you want to keep doing, build on, or stop doing, because we've learned a lot about what works and doesn't work. And also we're much wiser about looking at those inequities and access issues. With that, I got one more thing before we open it up for questions. I did put in an example of a tool that FFI created, Full Frame Initiative created, which is an analysis tool that can kind of help you think about how your practices or program is impacting well-being. They have several different versions of this, but this is some of the tools they have used with their partners to kind of think about as well-being, how we're impacting well-being versus reacting to symptoms and insufficiencies. Great.
Thank you, Phyllis.
You're welcome.
It's a marvelous introduction to this. As we get to the end of the session, by the way, I will be inviting you to provide us some feedback on whether you'd be interested in the Midwest Center offering a full day, or probably more like 2 half-day in-depth sessions on well-being, probably in the spring of 22. But let's hear what folks have to say. You're welcome to share observations. You're certainly invited to offer questions. You can chat, or you can just unmute yourself. It's a word we didn't use more prior to 2 years ago, but take yourself off mute and just pose the question to Phyllis if you have one. So Phyllis, I'll start off with one of the ones that's popped up. As we move, here's an optimistic notion, but as we move beyond the pandemic, what do you see are going to be some of the most important ways that leaders will enhance or help us gain a better level of well-being, if you will? We're moving into a new domain.
I think it's going to be important for us as leaders to really take what we are learning and what has become revealed about the challenges for access to well-being, and not go back to business as usual, but really intentionally look at those domains and how we can build assets in those domains and work with people to create sustainable change. So I think it could, the danger is as we move beyond the pandemic, although we're not there yet, is to try to go back to normal, and really that should be not go back to normal. And I'm kind of tired of the word new normal, but for lack of a better word, we need to really create strategies that are much more effective in terms of sustainable long-term change.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, and it's messy, and it's not simple.
Are there comments or questions from our folks in the participants rooms? I can't see most people. You've got your videos off, so I can't interpret. Christina has raised the question. Actually, a couple have popped in now. Good. Christina has asked, in terms of organizational well-being, is the 4-day work week tied to this, or maybe even thinking about how might it be tied to that, pro and con?
Yeah, I mean, so well-being applies to organizations and your staff and as well. Looking, what is really optimal in terms of well-being and productivity. And I was just heard something on NPR or someplace the other day talking about that, and how really we only work about 6 hours a day anyway, and not really much beyond that. And that studies of how work-life balance, or work-life harmony maybe is a better way of looking at it, really does increase productivity. And it's not just about 4-day weeks, because for some, like if you're working in residential care, you have 24-hour needs, right? So it's about how do you balance that and create, but at the same time, don't sacrifice what your mission and vision is as well. But yeah, all that's a part of that.
Yeah, great point. Dominic has asked how well-being professionals, mental health professionals, et cetera, practice, or maybe the question is should practice self-care using, these all apply to us individually. You've alluded to that a minute ago, but what are your thoughts? What do you see, or what do you recommend?
Self-care is a big part of this. I would also, though, when we're looking at from a well-being framework, like slice it through those domains, and also looking at the historic, what does self-care mean for different people? Because it can be different. I know doing our Work with Full Frame initiative during a lot of the uprise and some of the impact of, say, for example, myself as a Black woman, how they responded to me met my specific needs as a Black woman, experienced that as, say, opposed to some other staff on who had different needs. So you got to create space. I would say look at self-care systemically. I think sometimes we focus narrowly on self-care, and we lose a way of really impacting culture, because whatever we're doing with our staff and our systems, we want to be doing with our, it should be a parallel process that should also be happening with the folks we're working with as well. So if you're gonna, you're giving your staff big time off, how are you helping your clients have big time off or whatever? So, it's just kind of creating that we all need this.
Thank you. Now there's a related question. Angela has chimed in with another thoughtful couple of questions really here that sort of are at multiple levels building on that. She says there are many organizations, particularly charity organizations, that want to keep issues at the surface level for their own financial sustainability. How do you approach them about systemic level changes when they're in bed with organizations and agencies that cause harm to certain communities? What do you do if they resist systemic change and want to continue normalizing aid to profit off vulnerable communities?
Such a great question and really good observation. I would contend that typically in any given system that there are people who, if given the right information, will respond to it and will see it. But, we're dealing with many, many, many years of systems being baked in some of these structures that are harmful to people, right? So it's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep pushing towards that change. I was fortunate to work in a system here in Kansas City when I started out as a young professional in juvenile justice, to have these very innovative leaders who were like, how we're treating kids in this system is not right. It is hurting kids. And it's, and really we kind of looked, and there's lots of people you guys might know who were part of that, Gail Hobbs and Tim Decker and myself. And, it was shifting people's thinkings and heart first. Is chipping away at those mental models and narratives that people have that hold some of these harmful practices and policies in place. And so you had to really kind of get to it at that level. We didn't really see change in our system until people's hearts and minds changed about how they were viewing kids and families and communities. When we got some of that shifting happened, then our practices and policy and culture changed to align with that. But it's such a good question. And I know the other place you can think about looking at some ideas and recommendation is the Wellbeing Blueprint, which is a community of action that is looking at strategies, has a set of principles, and I don't know how many, 42 recommendations on how to move into a well-being orientation. And particularly as it relates to the pandemic. And one of the handouts that I shared has a link to that blueprint.
Great. Yeah. And again, Mark Culver has posted the box address. Click on that and you'll see a couple of these resources, and the links in them are to more.
And on the blueprint website, we did an event that talked to two foundations that have actually shifted how they look at how they do grants and work with folks that don't support kind of those structures that are harmful to people, and kind of moves and try to get rid of some of the barriers between money to people to do what they need to do to take care of themselves. And so, and it's on that, the link to that event, it was recorded, you can see that too. The two women that were talking were really powerful in how they were perceiving and what they were doing.
Great. Earlier in the session, you used the word, didn't surprise me, but you used the word co-creating. Mm-hmm. In this work. Can you say more about how, maybe in your own experience even, you have worked to enable or cause, sort of launch the process of co-creation, which ultimately, of course, means that it's not just you or me as a leader doing something, where it's all it's all done together.
Yeah, I think, kind of I probably many of you all have kind of had training or been through things where we kind of shifted from doing for to doing with. And then this is kind of like a deeper level of that, not even just doing with, it's co-creating with whatever. So if you're working on a treatment plan, whose plan is it? Who owns that plan? Do we own it? Do we create it, or is this plan created by the folks who are going to have to live it and do it? And us supporting that. So it's kind of shifting your thinking and looking at people as full people who have strengths and challenges and talents to bring to the table, and have the ability to move themselves to a different place if they so choose to. And it's our job to help them do what they think, do what they need to do, not what we think they need to do, if that makes sense. A lot of times I've seen where plans are written, and then we've moved, we might get a little bit of input, but really it's after the plan has been done versus trying to get some input and co-creation of it during the planning process, not just after the plan is done.
Yeah, make no plans without us. We do have a few minutes left. Other questions and comments that others would care to share? You can be questions. You also can share observations about ways you've tried to actually put well-being in some form or another into action. As Phyllis said, we have observed that you know, there are many people who are trying to behave consistently with part, if not all, of this orientation, but they have never called it that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of what we're doing with that community is we're trying to lift up folks who are doing it as examples, because sometimes when we're trying to make those kind of shifts in thinking, it can feel impossible. So it's important to point out folks who have had some success and track record.
Phyllis, maybe you could talk for a minute. I don't see other questions popping up just now. Perhaps you could speak for a minute to you made reference to the community, and you've alluded to this, but you know, maybe you could offer a little more information about the organizational linkages that Full Frame is trying to grow with the network, the community coming together. Yeah.
So yeah, like I had said earlier, the Wellbeing Blueprint is a plan that has 6 core principles that are looking at how we can move through this pandemic towards sustainable change and well-being for all, kind of with the tagline, everybody deserves a shot at well-being. And it started as a conversation in the Full Frame initiative with the executive director and some of her board folks. And then it quickly began to think, you know, with the ideas that we're in this place right now where, you know, everything's disrupted, and through this disruption, can we like use this as an opportunity to really create and address some of the issues and challenges and create a path for people to navigate this during the COVID and then beyond. And so it was written by a group of folks, system leaders and community folks, together, kind of thinking this through around what these core principles should be. And with each of those core principles, there's some recommended actions and some examples of how that principle is playing out. So the principles are: start with what matters to people, well-being, push against harms being concentrated in communities already facing the greatest adversity, build on instead of undermining social connection and social capital in communities, build financial stability. Our first iteration of it was give people cash, but so we like that one, but we had to kind of, we changed it. Build financial stability, span boundaries, and set our develop to sustaining transformation beyond the pandemic. So those are the core principles of that. And we offer, Full Frame is kind of provides backbone support to it, but it's not ours, it's this community. But we help organize events and conversations related to the Wellbeing Blueprint and the Wellbeing Agenda. And so on that blueprint, you'll see several of the events. We've had events on centering community. We had an event on 911 recently, you know, the harm, you know, what's the harm with 911 and how 911 impacts communities and the history of that system. So those are the kind of things we're looking at in that group, and anybody's is open to anybody. So
it really is a community coming together to embrace, learn from each other, and try to be more intentional, it sounds like, in actually embracing this. So we've been invited to ask you to share your thoughts on how to get boardrooms to implement co-creation and well-being, how to pull this into strategic plans. Colette.
Yeah, that's such a good question. We were recently talking in full frame about how do we think about this when we're working with people who are not considered service providers, like boards, funders, those kind of things. And one of the things we felt like would be that can help that and move that is that, you know, we need to bring into those boards and into those donors kind of these core principles, and be able to illustrate it and show those core principles to them, and perhaps create activities or questions or conversations that help people kind of begin to grapple around some of the narratives and assumptions that are running around unexamined. So we can help boards look at their unexamined assumptions, and donors, then that might help shift their thinking to a more co-creation kind of strategy. And the ladies that I was telling you about, Colette, that they were talking about how difficult it's been for them in the funder world with the way they shifted. So you might find them really interesting.
Yeah. So Juliana Sellers has highlighted the Black-centric mental wellness conference that's coming up. Check in the chat for that information. You know, as somebody who works with boards a lot, Phyllis, I would say that if we want organizations to embrace these, we really need to talk with boards about these principles, because what you're describing is a new orientation and really principles for how we work together in our community and with our colleagues. And at best, maybe at most important, if they're not really principles the organization can say, yes, we believe in these, then it seems to me you can't partly believe in them. They're either there and you commit yourself to it, even though you may be struggling to find all the ways to make it work, because there are the trade-offs you described, but it's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. And you think about it, systems will, to admit that you're doing things when your system's supposed to help somebody, and you have to kind of look really hard at what you're doing, and to say, hey, wow, we really kind of hurt people here. That's a level of vulnerability that sometimes is hard for people to get to.
Yeah. Yep. And we have to support each other in that journey along the way.
Yeah. Just to support each other and the courage to kind of speak what is.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I really appreciate your presentation. As you're sharing all of your insights and folks are raising the questions, it comes back, my perspective is, as a nation, I think we're actually experiencing a crisis of well-being right now. And we're getting a lot of acting out in a lot of counterproductive ways by folks of all sorts of identities, et cetera, because they don't feel well, they don't feel safe. And while I don't relate to some as well as I relate to others, none of us is going to relate to all of them well. You made that core point of trying to understand it from, our colleague Scott Helms talking about human-centered design and all that. Again, it's going back to understanding it from the perspective and lived experience of those who are in the system and what's happening to them. So Phyllis, thank you so much for the chance to introduce this concept